Actually, I'm a trained King scholar. I'm not just taking one quote from "I Have a Dream" out of context and claiming I know everything that there is to know about King. So the part one today, I'm going to title "Feet Are Tired, but Souls Are Rested." That comes from a quote from one of the foot soldiers in the movement, and we have to be clear that the leaders of the Montgomery movement had cars. The preachers were middle class. They had cars. They didn't take the bus. Who took the bus? The domestic workers, primarily women, primarily maids, housekeepers, low-wage domestic workers, nannies, maids, other forms of low-wage workers. These are the people that took the bus. These are the people that walked for over a year. These are the people who carpooled for over a year. And one of them got called out by one of the preachers, by King, in a mass meeting. And they asked her how she was doing. And she said, "My feet are tired, but my soul is rested." And this defined the dedication and the commitment and the passion of these unnamed foot soldiers who defied everything, including white supremacy and including an economy that was rigged against them, to break segregation. And the first major victory of the civil rights movement with Dr. King. So the Montgomery movement began on December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. One of the greatest honors of my life was waiting on Rosa Parks in a little grocery store in Detroit when I was about 20 years old. I was a scary-looking hippie punk. I had like scary white boy dreadlocks. I was dressed like a hippie, and I was ringing cash register at the Cass Corridor Food Co-op. And this is years before you had scanners. You had to ring everything up by hand on the cash register. And we had a lot of our clientele were very people who represented their African heritage very vividly in their dress. This is in inner city Detroit, Michigan. Closest that you maybe have seen if you've not been to inner city Detroit would be like inner city Memphis or inner city Atlanta. This was a place where Black is Beautiful expressions were very vibrant. And so you would have like Black Muslims and Rastafarians and these like pretty prominent dudes that like shopping the store for like some ginseng root or whatever. And I'll never forget the day because it was right before closing time, and they started giving cuts. And Cass Corridor, Detroit is not a kind of cut-giving kind of place. We don't give cuts in the Cass Corridor. It's not the kind of thing that happens. And I was like, what's wrong? Why are everybody, giving cuts? And this diminutive little old woman comes, walking up to the cash register to buy like a little parcel of bulk herb tea, like just a little paper bag of like some chamomile or something. And she gets out her tattered membership card because you got 10% off if you were a member of this food co-op where I worked. And I looked at the membership card, and lo and behold, I already figured out what was going on. But yes, I was giving some herb tea to Rosa Parks. It was definitely a highlight of my life, even at 51 years. But Rosa Parks, she was, the key pages in your textbook were assigned for today, by the way, in the autobiography, pages 50 to 99 to cover this period. But Rosa Parks was already in the movement. She wasn't just some random person who did this random thing. They strategized, and she knew what she was getting herself into. And one of the things that King asked himself in this context is boycott too militant? Is a boycott too radical? Is depriving your economic, dollars, of a commodity an effective form of action? Is it coercive? Is it mean? King is asking himself in our text today, is it Christian? Now, it's not, I don't know if it happened this year, but it happened last year because people were protesting the NFL. You had one group boycotting the NFL because they weren't supporting the freedom of expression of their Black and brown players who were doing radical acts of visible kind of symbolic protest during the games. And then you had people protesting the NFL because they were supporting the players, right? So on the one hand, you had some people said that they weren't doing enough to support community efforts to end police brutality, and they weren't, no one would hire our friend Colin Kaepernick. No one would give the man a job. And so then you had the other hand, people protesting against the NFL, because they thought the NFL was being too nice to these players and wasn't being supporting Trump enough. And then you have people protesting the NFL because of head injuries or something like this, right? So there's all these groups now that boycott the NFL. I don't watch NFL. No, I don't. No, not in my house. You won't see any NFL. But it's not having that big of an impact because
watch football.
Vince, I'm sorry?
People who like watching football.
Right. It's not like what percent of Americans who previously watched the NFL are now boycotting the NFL. We don't. It's a drop in the bucket. We can't. There's no. The ratings have gone down. It is documented that ratings have gone down, but it's a drop in the bucket. And so the thing we have to grapple with, first of all, is a boycott a too mean of a tactic to wage your opinion against an institution that you find objectionable? Which the segregated buses in Montgomery were objectionable to the majority of the black citizens who rode the bus. But is it even an effective tactic? We see lots of boycotts. I see boycotts on Facebook and Twitter. I'm not shopping at Whole Foods because blah blah blah, and Kroger can't get my dollars. I'm not gonna buy from this. Right? Is anybody currently boycotting anything? Is there anything anybody's currently not shopping at, not buying? Is anyone currently withholding their dollars at all from anybody? Have you ever withheld your dollars from anybody that you can think of, that you can remember? You can, Delmarine, who have you withheld your dollars from? Chick-fil-A. Yeah, I try to avoid Chick-fil-A. I used to avoid Walmart, but I've kind of come around. I've come on the fence around Walmart. So this boycott had almost 100% participation. 100% participation. I can't emphasize how radical and amazing and unheard of that is, before and since. There were certain elements of the boycott that helped make it successful. Not every night, but most nights they had mass meetings. And what a mass meeting was is that the leaders of the boycott, who are predominantly Christian Protestant ministers in the black churches, would get together and hold a revival. Old school revival with singing and foot stomping and amening and some really fired up sermons that were also calls to action. The most famous being King's opening sermon on December 5th, the Monday night when the boycott began. It's in your autobiography. You can listen to it on the YouTube. I recommend, the text is not in our other textbook. I recommend this highly as a possible text for paper one, because the rhetorical moves that he makes in this speech are incredible. Remember, we're looking at the rhetoric, the use of language, and the theology of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That'd be the second paper, actually, I should say. The rhetoric paper is the second paper. It's down the line. Don't have to worry about it too much. So the mass meetings, they organized a carpool that was extremely effective. And they had the support of some white folks. Some white folks would drive in the carpool. Next week, my lecture portion is going to be on white privilege, white participation in the movement, and white racism. It's a talk I designed as a white person who is anti-racist for other white people who want to wrestle with being anti-racist. I think it's very important in a context like Cookeville that we get that out of our system early in the semester. There's some key definitions. A lot of times a white person has someone call out some of their inherent racism, and the white person falls into this fit of white fragility because they don't know what white racism actually is. And so they think, oh, I'm not a racist, and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, we're going to teach you all what the sociological and academic definitions of these terms are, and give you a little bit of liberation training next Wednesday. But we're going to watch a film about women in the movement. And it's a narrative, it's a fictional depiction of a factual relationship between a white woman of privilege and her black housekeeper, played by Sissy Spacek and Whoopi Goldberg. It's going to be like an outstanding, kind of mind-blowing thing that we're going to experience in The Long Walk Home. Okay. So there are going to be some unsung heroes that we learn about in Montgomery that, again, in the first paper, not the rhetoric paper is the second paper. The first paper is an unsung heroes paper. So you all get to know that Martin is in a larger stream. Remember, the movement made Martin. Martin did not make the movement. Martin joined something that was already going on, and he became its spokesperson and its most visible prophetic leader, but he was not the engineer of the movement. So Ralph Abernathy emerges in the Montgomery movement, and he is King's closest associate for the entirety of his life. He is present at the mountaintop speech in Memphis on April 3rd, 1968. He introduces Dr. King. He and King are best friends. Somebody that is never gotten, I think, enough props because of his work in organized labor. His work in black organized labor is E.D. Nixon, and he was part of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He worked on trains, and he's one of the firecrackers behind the Montgomery movement, and he's one of the real strategists and one of the real thinkers, behind the movement. He's one of the people that said, we can't just have anybody sit down. We got to have somebody like Rosa Parks. They had actually had other boycotts in other cities. There had been other people who had defied the Montgomery bus law, but for whatever reason, the organizers in NAACP and other groups did not think of these people as suitable to be a leader, and they picked Rosa because she had a certain pedigree that they felt would be a good optics. We hear about that today in the media of movement, but they've been thinking about optics, since way back. Since we were here last, there's been a major optics crisis in American civil rights because of what happened last weekend in Washington, D.C. I'm sure you all hopefully have heard about it. If you've not, definitely look up the Covington Catholics crisis and the Native American March, Indigenous Peoples March, and the Black Hebrews, and the whole dealio. It's quite astonishing, but very instructive for this course. Joanne Robinson, I'm a big hero of hers because she was I believe she was an English professor, but she was a professor at Alabama State, an HBCU there, and she was a major leader of the movement. But what's really cool is the original reach that got 100% participation was not on Twitter, was not on Facebook, because they didn't even have it then. It wasn't even done by phone calls, but there was probably a lot of phone trees that went on. But they made mimeographs. They didn't even have a photocopier. It hadn't even been invented yet. A mimeograph machine precedes the photocopier. And they stayed up all night. These are grown women. They went to Alabama State. They pulled an all-nighter. They wrote a manifesto, and they mimeographed it. And they called on people to boycott the buses on Monday, December 5th. And they went all over Montgomery distributing these leaflets. Some of the original organizing calls started at 5 a.m. I don't just imagine, I don't take kindly to people calling me at 5 a.m. And if it is, it better be an emergency. ML got that first call from E.D. Nixon at 5 in the morning and was like, I need to get back to you on this. King was a notorious early riser and late. He didn't sleep a lot in his career. He went to bed late and he got up early. It's said that he liked to pray for 2 hours in the morning before he began a day. And this is folklore. I don't have a source for this, but what do you do when it's really rough and really busy, Dr. King, and you're really busy? He said, then I'd pray for 4 hours instead of 2 hours. So they were getting up early. They were staying up late. They were working around the clock. Another major unsung hero that we're going to learn about is going to be depicted really well in the film. And there's a sample paper going around. Make sure that's, I started it around the room. Make sure it makes the way around. Everybody's welcome to browse that as much as you want, because that's a sample of the paper one that y'all are going to be doing. And it's written about Bayard Rustin. And you'll get him a good slice of him in the film in a few minutes. But you can't describe him as being wild enough, I don't know how much you've learned in other courses about the 50s or how much you've studied about the bohemian movements of the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, but there's jazz and, there's smoke-filled rooms and there's liquor and blah, blah, blah. And Bayard Rustin was the mind and the brains behind the March on Washington. He was a great member of the movement, but he never got a lot of press because he was homosexual, he was bohemian, he was from the far left, he had socialist and communist ties, but he was also involved in the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He knew his nonviolence theory inside and out. There's a crazy thing that goes around every year, and I think it's going to be in the movie, this story, but it goes around every year on MLK Day on Twitter. Usually the National Rifle Association will post something about how when King applied for a gun permit and was denied a gun permit, well, King was deciding during Montgomery, when they were bombing his house during this exact time period, that he needed lots of guns around. Until Bayard Rustin pointed out to him, if you're going to be, the Black Moses, I mean, he didn't say if you're going to be the Black Moses, but he basically said if you're going to be the Black Moses, if you're going to be this great American Gandhi, you can't be like carrying guns everywhere. And Coretta was a true disciple of nonviolence, and so Coretta and Bayard kind of double teamed Martin, and Martin he wasn't armed the rest of his career. He became more deeply invested in nonviolence when people tried to blow up his house, not less than violent. When he saw the violence that other people were willing to do, he became more interested in love. When he saw the hatred that other people were willing to do, he became more interested in love. He became more peaceful. He didn't become conformist. He didn't become conciliatory to injustice, but he got deeper into the gospel teaching of sacrificial love. The cross is a part of the Baptist tradition out of which he comes, and the cross is the ultimate example of somebody willingly being executed by the state for a message of peace and love. And so he's a Christian in that way. So Rosa Parks, she was Christian, she was educated, she was involved in the NAACP. She was a true participant in the movement. She was not just somebody that just happened to get arrested, okay? They've been wanting to launch a movement like this for a long time, and the chemistry and the synchronicity came together with a young leader like Martin Luther King Jr., who was elected as the first president of the Montgomery Improvement Association at the beginning of the movement, and this catapulted him into national prominence that would last for his entire life. And so this is the beginning, really. The chronology of our course is 55 to 68, and this is where it starts, in Montgomery, Alabama. A shout out and reminder again that in March 1st, if anyone's free on the first Friday of spring break, we're going to go to Montgomery, and we would love for you on a whirlwind tour to Montgomery. We'd love for you to come with us. This was an overwhelming task for them to put together. It was not easy. They started this in December. The heat really came on in January. And I want you to look outside. We live in the South. We're a little bit further north than Montgomery. But what is January weather in the South? It's a lot of rain. A lot of sideways rain and a lot of wind and a lot of cold. And these people refused to ride the bus, not just when it was sunny, but when it was raining. Maybe they joined a carpool, but then they'd have to deal with cars breaking down. They had to be at work on time. If they weren't at work on time, they could lose their job. Most of them lied through their teeth to the boss about this boycott. These white employers were trying to get all kinds of dirt on the boycott. They would ask prying questions. They trusted their house staff, most of them, whether it was a nanny or a maid or what have you, so they thought they could kind of be, prying and getting, find out the real scoop on this movement. You come to find out, the white people had no idea what was going on. I read about this guy. He was a Lutheran minister who had come from out of town, and he was a white minister of a black church. And this occasionally will happen in mainline denominations where the denomination will send somebody, okay? And church is important. We talked about this a lot last week, but church is very important in the black community. And so if they can't find a black pastor, a white pastor will have to do. And so this Lutheran guy was a white pastor in a black church, and he was very very committed to the movement, but he was kind of just, he definitely wasn't a leader. He was definitely a participant, And some of the white Montgomeryans assumed that this guy had to be in charge of the movement because they didn't think a movement that this was this organized and this well orchestrated could be done by black people themselves. They must be some outside communists running this movement. There must be secret agents, and they loved the fact that Martin was from out of town. Because that fixed their narrative a little bit. Well, he's from out of town, northern educated, uppity, and all this kind of. They threw everything at these people. They made it over a year. The early part of it, though, it was tense. It was so tense. When they first started the boycott, the boycott organizers made a mistake that is common in liberal and progressive movements in the United States forever. They didn't ask for what they wanted. They asked for what they thought they could get away with. They didn't actually ask to desegregate the buses. They just asked to modify the existing segregation policies. The policies were very confusing. White people boarded from the front of the bus. Black people boarded from the back of the bus. And the middle of the bus was always no man's land. But the etiquette was that when the seats were full, if a white passenger got on, the black person closest to the front got up and moved to the back to stand to give up their seat for the whites. And so they start tinkering around. They're just trying to they're moving deck chairs on the Titanic. They aren't trying to solve the problem of a racist system. They're just trying to modestly adjust this racist system. And white Montgomery went into attack mode. This modest, kindler, gentler racism was too radical for white Montgomery. I don't know how far I can go to. So they're exercising these incredibly moderate, middle-of-the-road demands, and this was too radical for white Montgomery. So they go into these early negotiations, and there's this great scenario where you've got King and the MIA ministers on one side of the negotiating table, and you've got the city of Montgomery and the bus company on the other side of the table. And they bring this guy in from the White Citizens Council to sit at the city side of the table. The White Citizens Council was a private organization. It was not the bus company. It was not the city. It was a special interest group. It was the Klan without robes. It was the racist establishment, and it was the Klan without robes. And they said something to Martin King. Well, Martin King said something to them. He said, "How dare you bring the White Citizens Council into this negotiation? They have no place at this table." And basically, what the other white leaders of Montgomery said to Martin King was, of course the White Citizens Council has a right to be at this table because they're just like you. You're the black interest group, and they're the white interest group. So they equivocated the Klan and the White Citizens Council with a group of nonviolent Christian ministers that just wanted the right to ride a desegregated bus. What is the problem with false equivalence, class? And does this sound vaguely familiar of anything we've seen extremely recently in American history? Does anybody know what happened about a year and a few months ago where this exact false equivalence happened? And it's to our great detriment that we're allowing this false equivalence to go on. And so I really wanted to point this out to you, that this false equivalence that we're dealing with today started in the 50s in the movement, and it's going to happen until we're free. I mean, until the true gains of the King dream are fully realized, we're going to be fighting against this duplicity, this hypocrisy. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? In Virginia, in August of 2017, does nobody know what happened in Virginia in August of 2017? Come on, class. Oh, yeah, you did. Y'all did. Jog your memory. Guys were walking around with torches.
Oh, Charlottesville.
Thank you. Does everybody remember now? Does anybody not know what happened? So what happened in Charlottesville was this group decided to have a rally called Unite the Right, and they decided to basically have a march to support a statue. This wasn't a march for a cause per se, other than not taking down the statue. And the statue is of a Confederate icon that represents the lineage of white supremacy that this nation has inherited. And so you had these far-right groups who want to live in what they call a white ethno-state. They believe the United States of America should be dismantled and we should be broken up, kind of like what happened in Eastern Europe when the Soviet Union broke up and you have all these little countries. The Americas should be broken up into ethno-states, and there should be a white nation for only white people in this country. This is what these people want. And they decided to choose this statue in Charlottesville that they were contemplating taking down as their lightning rod. Well, they showed up. And this group is called the alt-right mainly because what they've done is they've gotten really sophisticated. They've written a lot of position papers. They've got a really good Twitter game. And so this is the Klan without masks. They're your age, and between your age and my age, but they tend to be younger than me and older than you, 20s and 30s. They wear white polo shirts, khakis, and sometimes they wear MAGA hats. And they chant things like blood and soil and Jews will not replace us, and things like this. And what happened, they did things like they surrounded a church with their torches where black and white people were worshiping together for pluralism, for the America that King knew. And these people were afraid to leave the church because there was basically a gang of white nationalists who surrounded them in their church. Then the police of Charlottesville stood down. The next day they held their rally outdoors. The police of Charlottesville stood down. So there were street fights all over Charlottesville between these different groups. And then they murdered a woman. They murdered a white woman. They ran her over with a car. I don't think it should matter what her skin color was. And then the President of the United States went on national television and said, well, there's good people on both sides. This is false equivalence. To say that the Civil Rights Movement and the Ku Klux Klan are the same thing, that's not the same thing. Now, maybe some of y'all got some skeletons in your lineage or whatever, and this is hard medicine that I'm teaching today. But own it, deal with it, decide where you stand for yourself. Not because somebody in your family told you that's the way you're supposed to believe, and work on that stuff. Because we're never going to learn if we don't figure that out. And so, but I always wanted to point this out because they did that to King. They said nonviolent ministers who want to desegregate the buses are the same as the racists, and King objected, and to his credit. They tried things like a fake settlement. They found some nobody black ministers. The black ministers that were running this thing were like the big shots. These guys were Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy were a big deal. And they were extremely articulate and extremely intelligent and extremely charismatic. And they found some nobody black ministers, apparently paid them off or did something. I don't know what they did to these guys. I don't know if we'll ever know, but they put an article in the paper that the boycott had been settled. They faked it. They faked it out. They announced that the black groups had given it, and basically what they had done is they had appointed these stooges. They would arrest King for driving 30 into 25. God help us all. And this is going to be the story of his entire life. He's going to be watched. He's going to be surveilled, driving 30 into 25. Lord help us. 115 activists were indicted. They turned themselves in, and then the movement got so much momentum when this happened because not only did they turn themselves in, they and did their time and dealt with the system. I'm going to talk about the principle of nonviolence in a minute, but one of the principles of nonviolent resistance in the Kingian tradition is that if there are consequences, you show up for your court date. If they give you 6 months, you say, thank you, sir, and you do your 6 months. You don't run, you don't go AWOL, you don't run from the consequences of your actions. People were saying, I wish I got indicted. It became a badge of honor. Why didn't I get indicted? Every once in a while, they put out these evil professors lists, these blacklists of evil subversive professors. As far as I know, I've never been on one, but a little bit got my feelings hurt. Just kidding. JK, I don't really want to be on that list. But in any event, I'd be honored if I was, is what I'm trying to say. They bombed King's house. I explained the story about Rustin and the guns on a previous slide. Martin Luther King is in his late 20s, and his dad is a major player, but more moderate and more conservative than Martin. I mean, by our today's standards, you would probably think of Daddy King as a very progressive black minister. But compared to how radical Martin Luther King Jr. was, his daddy was like the voice of reason. So his daddy drives from Atlanta to Montgomery and begs Martin to quit his pulpit, come home, move back in with mom and dad. Game over. You're going to die, son. Could you imagine being Daddy King? I mean, can you imagine what his life was like for the next 13 years? Your son has got a crosshairs around he's got a target on his back for his entire life. And Martin wasn't having none of it. His father, this is a quote in Mr. Branch's Parting the Waters. It's a voluminous day-by-day chronicling of the entire 13 years of the Martin movement, America during the King years. It's in like 3 volumes. The book's like, thousands of pages long. Anyway, I studied this guy Branch because it's just such a good resource. He said that Daddy King said to Martin, and this is a quote, "It would be better to be a live dog than a dead lion." Martin Luther King wasn't going to be nobody's dog, even if his daddy said so. He was going to be that lion. And he was going to be a lion of love. And he was going to never stop loving his enemies throughout this all. Which brings us to the other part of today's mini lecture, which is what is Kingian nonviolence? What is Kingian nonviolence? Please take a handout and pass them around. I've got enough for everybody, so make sure that everybody gets one. All right. I believe this resource has been put together later after King, but these are directly taken from Kingian's teachings. Principle number 1, nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. It is active nonviolent resistance to evil. It is aggressive spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. Nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. The end result of nonviolence is redemption and reconciliation. The purpose of nonviolence is the creation of the beloved community. The beloved community is Dr. King's paraphrase of the New Testament construct of the kingdom of God. And in all of the 4 Christian Gospels, Christ's teaching is based on this idea of the kingdom of God, the inbreaking of God's reign. That term, the beloved community, which we'll use throughout this course, comes directly from that idea. Principle 3, nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. This is so key, and this is what we forgot in call-out culture online. This is what we've forgotten in all the blaming and shaming that happens. And I'm going to make not a false equivalence, but I think a true equivalence that both left and right on social media engage in a form of ad hominem, of personal attack, which deflects us from the issue. True nonviolent revolutionaries believe that we are fighting against evil, not people. Okay? Since this is a theology course as well, in New Testament in Paulinian terms, this is the powers and the principalities. We're fighting against institutions. We're fighting against forces of evil that are larger than the individual. Principle 4, nonviolence holds that suffering can educate and transform. Nonviolence accepts suffering without retaliation. Unearned suffering is redemptive and has tremendous educational and transforming possibilities. This point is a hard one to stomach, especially when you've got somebody beating you up. And we did take blows, batons, feet, tear gas,